everyone, my name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I'm the kind of guy that you could come to and ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's his novels such as The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, which is not really a novel, or any of the satellite stories around the Silmarillion, or his translations, or his poetic works, or anything like that. I'm the guy that you can come to, and that's why I have this YouTube channel. Now, if you want to ask a question, you can feel free to do so right in the comments there. There's no problem with doing that. I try to answer as many of those as I can. If you want to be featured in a video, though, you want to ask your question on a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and be answered by people with relevant knowledge or expertise or experience, depending on the topic. And if you ask any sort of question related to Tolkien on there, you're going to see a list of names of people that you can send the question to. You can pick one name, you can pick many names, and my name will be at or near the top of that list. There was a link to my Quora account in the description of this video and every other video that I put up, as well as a link to my Quora space, which is called the Grey Havens, where it has all of my writing and the writing of a lot of other Tolkien scholars as well. So, there you have it. So I have 10 questions to get to today, and what's really interesting is I always say at the beginning, you heard me just say it, that you can ask questions not just about, the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or the Hobbit, but also about things like his translations and such, and that actually doesn't come up all that often. I don't often get questions about, say, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is partially see-through because the axe on the cover is green, and or Beowulf or the Fall of Arthur, or a little bit of work he did on the Jerusalem Bible or any of that sort of stuff. I don't often get questions about it, but today I do have a question specifically about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, although because of the nature of the question I had to go into a little bit of Beowulf as well, which is why I decided that I will be reading at the beginning of the stream here from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And before we get into that, I just want to say, of course, like the video, comment on the video, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're on the fence about that, you're like, well, I could do that, but how do I really know I want to? I'll ask you again at the end of the video, because if you get all the way to the end of the video and you're still watching, then obviously you want to subscribe. So I'll ask you again then as well. Anyway, here I have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which of course was written in Middle English originally. We're going to talk more about that later, because this does relate to one of the questions. And it's been translated many times. This specific translation was by J.R.R. Tolkien and edited by his son Christopher. And if you don't have this book, I highly recommend you get it, because it not only has the entirety of the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but you get two other medieval poems that Tolkien had translated, Pearl and Sir Orfeo. I had read from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight before, and I had read a little bit of Sir Orfeo at one point too. One day I'll have to read a little bit of Pearl. You also get a W.P. Kerr memorial lecture on Sir Gawain. But I wanted to read a little bit of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight here. I'm, kind of going in the middle here, starting from like the 70th stanza. We'll go from there and just read a bit of it. So here we go. In heavy darkness drowsing, the dream words muttered, as a man whose mind was bemused with many mournful thoughts, how destiny should doom on that day bring him, when he at the green chapel the great man would meet, and be obliged his blow to abide without debate at all. But when so comely she came, he recalled that his wits swept aside his slumbers, and swiftly made answer. The lady in lovely guise came laughing sweetly, bent down o'er his dear face, and deftly kissed him. He greeted her graciously with a glad welcome, seeing her so glorious and gaily attired, so faultless in her features and so fine in her hues, that at once joy upwelling went warm to his heart. With smiles sweet and soft they turned swiftly to mirth, and only brightness and bliss was broached there between them so gay. They spoke, then speeches good, much pleasure was in that play, great peril between them stood, unless Mary for her knight should pray. For she, queenly and peerless, pressed him so closely, led him so near the line that at last he must needs either refuse her with offence or her favours there take. He cared for his courtesy, lest a caitiff he proved, yet more for his sad case if he should sin commit, and to the owner of the house, to his host, be a traitor. God help me, said he, happen that shall not. Smiling sweetly aside from himself, then he turned all the fond words of favour that fell from her lips. Said she to the knight then, now shame you deserve, if you love not one that lies alone here beside you, who beyond all women in the world is wounded in heart, unless you have a leman more beloved, whom you like better, and have affianced faith to that fair one so fast and true, that your release you desire not, and so I believe now. And to tell me, if that be so truly, I beg you, for all sakes that men swear by, conceal not the truth in guile. The knight said, by St. John, and softly gave a smile, Nay, lover have I none, and none will have meanwhile. Those words, said the woman, are the worst that could be. But I am answered indeed, and 'tis hard to endure. Kiss me now kindly, and I will quickly depart. I may but mourn while I live as one that much is in love. Sighing, she sank down, and sweetly she kissed him. Then soon she left his side, and said as she stood there, Now, my dear, at this parting do me this pleasure. Give me something as thy gift, thy glove it might be, that I might remember thee, dear man, my mourning to lessen. Now, on my word, then, said he, I wish I had here the loveliest thing for thy delight in my land I possess, for worthily you have earned wondrously often, more reward by rights than within my reach would now be, save to allot you as love-token thing of little value. Beneath your honour it is to have here and now a glove for a good and as gift of Sir Gawain. And I am here on an errand in unknown lands, and have no bearers with baggage and beautiful things, unluckily, dear lady, for your delight at this time. A man must do as he is placed, not be pained, nor aggrieve, said he. Said she so comely clad, Nay, noble knight and free, though naught of yours I had, you should get a gift from me. A rich ring she offered him of red gold fashioned, with a stone like a star standing up clear, that bore brilliant beams as bright the sun. I warrant you it was worth wealth beyond measure. But the knight said nay to it, and announced then at once, I will have no gifts, for God, of your grace at this time. I have none to return you, and naught will I take. She profited and pressed him, and her pleading refused, and swore swiftly upon his word that accept it he would not. And she, sorry that he refused, said to him further, If to my ring you say nay, since too rich it appears, and you would not so deeply be indebted to me, I shall give you my girdle, less gain will that be. She unbound a belt swiftly that, embracing her sides, was clasped above her kirtle under her comely mantle. Fashioned it was of green silk and with gold finished, though only braided round about, embroidered by hand, and this would give to Gawain, and gladly besought him, of no worth though it were, to be willing to take it. And he said nay, he would not, he would never receive either gold or jewelry, ere God the grace sent him to accomplish the quest on which he had come thither. And therefore I pray you, be not angry, and cease to insist on it. For to your suit I will ever say no. I am deeply in debt to you for the favour that you show, to be your servant true, for ever in weal or woe. Do you refuse now this silk, said the fair lady, because in itself it is poor, and so it appears. See how small 'tis in size, and smaller in value. But one who knew of the nature that is knit there within should appraise it probably at a price far higher. For whoever goes girdled with this green riband, while he keeps it well clasped closely about him, there is none so hardy under heaven, that to hew him were able. For he could not be killed by any cunning of hand. The knight then took note, and thought now in his heart 'twould be a prize in that peril that was appointed to him. When he gained the green chapel, to get there his sentence, as if by some slight he were not slain, 'twould be a sovereign device. Then he bore her with his rebuke, and debated not her words, and she pressed him on the belt, and profited in earnest, and he agreed, and she gave it very gladly indeed, and prayed him, for her sake, to part with it never, but on his honour hide it from her husband. And he then agreed that no one should ever know, nay, none in the world but they, with earnest heart and mood, great thanks of oft did say. Then the knight did so good, a third time kissed that day. So, what we have here, this is the middle part of the poem. It's sort of getting close to the conclusion, and the basic premise here is that Sir Gawain was at a feast with King Arthur and all the knights of the Round Table, and in this feast came a Green Knight, and he offered this deal that he would give this magnificent axe to anyone who would land a blow on him, under the deal being that he would then, whoever it was that landed a blow on the Green Knight, would have to travel to the Green Chapel 1 year later, on Christmas, and receive the same blow that was given. And Sir Gawain beheaded the knight, which was a very foolish mistake, because now, he gets this axe, and he was probably thinking, well, if I just kill this guy, then I won't have to have him do anything to me. He could have just nicked him, and that would have been a blow, because the Green Knight was not attempting to fight or defend himself in any way. He was just standing there, and he gives him the axe, and a year passes, and now he has to go on this quest to the Green Chapel and abide by his word. Because if he doesn't abide by his word, he is no sort of knight, and certainly not one fit to be the King of England after, King Arthur passes, for he is, in line, as he is related to King Arthur. And Sir Gawain goes through all these sorts of crazy adventures. If you've never read it, I recommend you read it, or at least see the movie version that came out a few years ago. It was just called The Green Knight, and it was absolutely spectacular. A really, really good version of it. But I do highly recommend you get this book, specifically the J.R.R. Tolkien version of it. And here, he's sort of near to the Green Chapel, and he's staying with this lord and this lady in this house for a few days. And there's sort of this weird seduction game going on where the lord goes out hunting, and then while the lord is out, the lady tries to seduce him and give him gifts, and he's trying to not be seduced, partly because it is, wrong to do so with a married woman. And as he said, to betray his host, the Lord, by fooling around with his wife, which would be a wrong thing to do, even if she is, a willing participant. It's still, you're doing it right there in his house, in his marital bed. So obviously Sir Gawain is not so interested in that. But he has a deal with the Lord that anything given to him has to be given to the Lord. So every time she kisses him, he has to go and kiss this guy when he comes back, just to prove that, yes, I am, doing what I said I would do. She gave me a kiss, so I have to give you a kiss. And in most versions of it, in most translations, the Green Knight actually turns out to be the Lord, and this was all a test set up by King Arthur. In the movie version, it was a little bit more ambiguous of the nature of the actual Green Knight. He was certainly magical in nature. Morgana was absolutely involved in it in some sense, but she was trying to protect him. And there's definitely a connection in the film version and in many translations between Morgana and the lady. And here we see him receiving this girdle, this belt, from the lady as a gift, because he wouldn't take anything valuable from her. He wouldn't take a ring or anything like that. Interesting Tolkien talking about rings. But she's saying this is a magical artifact. If you hold it, you will not be harmed, and that of course comes into play in the film. But it's something that Morgana gave him, and then he lost, and that the lady can give it back to him. The film is its own version. It's not specifically based on Tolkien's version. There's a lot of different versions of this because it was originally probably an oral tradition before it was written down. But anyway, like I said, we have lots of questions to get to, and one of them is about Tolkien's translation, so we're going to get to that as well. We have 10 questions, so let's go ahead and start this up with your first question. Our first question comes in anonymously, and it is, what is the connection between the Maiar and angels? So this is easy to understand. The Maiar are specifically a type of angel. In Tolkien's world, the world itself, the universe, was created by Eru Ilúvatar, who's God. And it was based on the singing of the Ainur, which are the angels. These are, of course, the words that the elves came up with to call these beings. Eru means the one, as he is above all others and he is alone in terms of power and majesty and grace. Ilúvatar means all-father, as he is the father of all of the Ainur and the children of Ilúvatar, which are the elves and the men. Ainur means holy ones, which are described explicitly as angels by Tolkien, though he acknowledged that in some of the denizens of Arda, which is the earth, they would see them as minor gods, but they were not actually minor gods. Many of the Ainur chose to live within the world that they had helped create, and out of these, there were some subdivisions: Aratar, Valar, and Maiar. All of these are angels, just differentiated by levels of power and grace and majesty and beauty. Aratar means the high ones, and these are the 8 greatest of the Ainur, which compose of Manwe, Varda, Ulmo, Yavanna, Aula, Namo, Nienna, and Orma. And then we have Valar. Now, Valar means powers, and this is the 15 greatest of the Ainur, which includes the 8 Aratar as well, and as well as some others. We have Melkor, who is actually the mightiest of all the Ainur, but it seems that the Aratar phrase was created after he was cast out of the Order of the Valar, and thus he's not included as one of the Aratar. And then there are 6 more Valar. There's Vaera, Tulkis, Nessa, Urmo, Esta, and Vana. All of the other angels within the world that are not of the Valar are called Maiar, which means beautiful. Though Melkor was cast out of the Circle of Doom of the Valar, and he was not counted as one of the Valar by the elves, he is a Vala. And he was not, we'll say he wasn't demoted to Maya status. They just sort of refused to acknowledge him, and after a while they even would refuse to say his name. They would call him Morgoth instead, which means Dread Tyrant. Some examples of Maiar would be Ianwa, Ilmare, Osse, Mairon, who later became known as Sauron, and all of the Istari, which are the wizards: Saruman, Gandalf, Radagast, Romastano, and Marenitar. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Laurel Callahan. She's a good friend of mine, and she asked, did Gandalf have Glamdring, his sword, with him when he was trapped on top of Orthanc? Yes, he absolutely did. Gandalf was pretty much never parted from his sword. Gandalf first attained the sword known as Glamdring in a troll cave after facilitating the destruction of the 3 trolls. This was during The Hobbit, and the party raided the troll horde for supplies, finding plenty of unspoiled food, but also some fantastic weapons. 2 of the swords, they were very important weapons: Glamdring and Orcrist. So Glamdring means foe hammer, and Orcrist means goblin cleaver. Though they didn't know at the time when they received these weapons that they were important like that. Bilbo also took a dagger that was just about the right size to be sort of a short sword for him, which he later named Sting. Now, Elrond later on was the one that identified these swords as Glamdring and Orcrist, having read the runes on them and explained the importance of each, especially that Glamdring was once the sword of Turgon, who was the High King of the Noldor, who dwelled in the ancient city of Gondolin. Many people wonder why Gandalf couldn't read the runes that were on the sword, and Tolkien's explanation actually didn't make it into The Hobbit. He was planning on rewriting The Hobbit at some point, and he had an explanation already for that, but it didn't actually make it into the book. But the explanation was that these swords are actually very dirty after thousands of years of being, plundered over and over again, and they had all sorts of dirt and dried blood on them, and Elrond cleaned them, and then thus he was able to read the runes on them. So they may not have even realized there were runes on the sword, or if they did, they weren't very legible until they were able to get these swords cleaned properly. Orcrist wound up being confiscated from Thorin Oakenshield by Thranduil, but after Thorin's death, Thranduil returned the sword, laying it on Thorin's body, and it was interred with him. Glamdring, however, never really left Gandalf's side. He kept it with him at all times, and he seemed to treasure it greatly, so greatly that he still had it after dying and being returned, and as he was returned to the very same body, and he was scooped up in Gwaihir's claws and borne away, naked and afraid before he even had the chance to stand up. He must have still been clutching at the sword when he died, and he never let go of it. Saruman, of course, did not attempt to disarm Gandalf. His sword and his staff were still with him, as well as his Ring of Power, which Saruman was not supposed to know about, but he did know about it. You may wonder why, when taking Gandalf prisoner, why Saruman wouldn't, take his weapons and the ring that so bothered Saruman, because he's envy of Gandalf being given such an important gift by an elf, and not him getting that was a lot of what fueled his whole descent into madness and darkness and eventually evil. The answer is simple. While Saruman talked a big game about, planning to have Gandalf sent to Mordor to be tortured by Sauron, he really had no intention of actually doing this. Saruman may have left the path of wisdom, but he was smart enough to know that he didn't want Gandalf as an enemy, especially with how beloved Gandalf was and how many great connections he had with virtually every culture in Middle-earth. Saruman wanted Gandalf to join him in his plan to pretend to join with Sauron and then either usurp him or attempt to turn the power of the Dark Lord from evil to good. And he was a bit taken aback that Gandalf did not listen to what he thought was the perfect plan. He was essentially putting Gandalf in a big timeout at the top of the tower, thinking that, being stuck out in the cold with nothing but his thoughts would make him come around. Imagine his surprise when he checked on him a few days after he had already escaped, probably to attempt to, talk to him kindly and offer him warmth in exchange for his cooperation, only to find Gandalf's long gone. Gandalf had the sword with him after this, and he did not go into Isengard thinking that he would, be detained, so it's not as if he stashed it away somewhere. The only conclusion that I would say is that, yes, he had the sword with him, all the time that he was in Isengard. And I had a little bit of a conversation with Laurel after this about the sword, and so of course he definitely brought it to the Undying Lands, and I asked Laurel, do you think he gave it back to Turgon? Because of course Turgon, he's definitely out of Mandos at this point, probably been out of there for thousands of years and just enjoying the company of his kin. And can you imagine Gandalf being like, I found your sword, I used it to kill a Balrog, it was fun. That would be pretty amusing. Anyway, let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in from, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Anka Eisman, who asks, in The Return of the King, when Denethor is about to burn himself in a pyre, he references the heathen kings of old. What does heathen mean in Middle-earth? So this is really interesting because it's sort of open for interpretation, but here's my thought on it. Denethor is making a rather horrifying reference to events of the past, but it works better if we compare the line in the movie to the way he said it in the book. So let's start with the book. Here is the quote as Denethor said in Book 5, Chapter 3 of The Lord of the Rings. Why do the fools fly, said Denethor. Better to burn sooner than late, for burn we must. Go back to your bonfire, and I will now go to my pyre. To my pyre! No tomb for Denethor and Faramir, no tomb. No long, slow sleep of death embalmed. We will burn like heathen kings before even a ship sailed hither from the west. The west has failed. Go back and burn. So, I believe that Denethor is kind of getting a B- in history here. Though he's gone mad, and it's, he's under a lot of stress at this point. So I will forgive him for forgetting there were ships from Numenor that came to Middle-earth before the burnings happened. But perhaps he was specifically meaning ships bearing his forebears, Elendil and the Faithful. Heathen is a word in English that at one point meant dweller on the heath, or more, or perhaps less poetically, earthbound. It was to describe people who did not, for one reason or another, prescribe to the standard religion of their culture, and thus were bound to the earth, not the heavens. In real life, it tends to be used interchangeably with pagan, which has a meaning that most people ignore. They usually say pagan, but they usually really mean heathen. Either way, to answer what events Denethor II is referring to, I give you a few chilling quotes from the Akalabeth chapter of the Silmarillion. First, we have this lovely passage that I'm going to read for you. None too soon was this done, for after the assault the king yielded to Sauron, and felled the White Tree, and turned then wholly away from the allegiance of his fathers. But Sauron caused to be built upon the hill in the midst of the city of the Númenóreans, Armenelus the Golden, a mighty temple. And it was in the form of a circle at the base, and their walls were 50 feet in thickness, and the width of the base was 500 feet across the center, and the walls rose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome. And that dome was roofed all with silver, and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light of it could be seen afar off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver became black. For there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a louver, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth, and it crackled and was consumed, but men marvelled at the reek that went up from it. So that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until slowly it passed into the west. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased. And in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor, that he should release them from death. And most often, from among the faithful they chose their victims, but never openly on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. But rather was cause sought against them that they hated the king, and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. These charges were for the most part false, yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. So, Sauron's influence over Numenor and its king, already a people largely fallen to a culture war between the faithful and the unfaithful, and the faithful are losing, he becomes so great that they build a temple to worship Melkor, also known as Morgoth or Satan. And they hope that this is going to give them back the long lifespan that they had that was waning, but of course it only made things worse. They made false accusations against people to be sacrificed to Melkor in the temple, though the real unspoken reason that the victims were sacrificed was that they were the faithful, those that would not worship Melkor. Then we get this. Then men grew afraid. Behold, the eagles of the lords of the west, they cried. The eagles of Manwë are come upon Numenor. And they fell upon their faces. Then some few would repent for a season, but others hardened their hearts, and they shook their fists at heaven, saying, The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first, the next blow shall be ours. These words the king himself spoke, but they were devised by Sauron. Now the lightnings increased and slew men upon the hills, and in the fields, and in the streets of the city, and a fiery bolt smote the dome of the temple, and shore it asunder. And it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was unshaken, and Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle, and defied the lightning, and was unharmed. And in that hour men called him a god, and did all that he would. When therefore the last portent came, they heeded it little, for the land shook under them, and a groaning as of thunder underground was mingled with the roaring of the sea, and smoke issued from the peak of the Meneltarma. But all the more did Ar-Pharazôn press on with his armament. So Manwë gives the warning shot to stop all this nonsense, this madness, and some even repent when the birds of heaven arrive, but not for long. They would repent for a season. Eventually, they just start getting smoked, Old Testament style, but Sauron, untouched by the lightning, is now worshipped as a god. The Valar's display of power only cemented Sauron's position. So back to this whole human sacrifice thing, here's the final passage I'll read. In that time, the fleets of the Númenóreans darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon the mountain, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were golden and black, and all things waited upon the words of Ar-Pharazôn. And Sauron withdrew into the inmost circle of the temple, and men brought him victims to be burned. Even as Pharazôn is going off to his doom, and in fact the doom of his entire kingdom, Sauron is still carrying out these rituals, and here it is explicitly mentioned that the victims are burned. These are the dark events that Denethor II was referring to, the heathens being the ones that did not follow what had now become the state religion of Númenor, the worship of Sauron, whom they now believed was Melkor incarnate. You may have one small sort of hanging chad of an issue here, wondering why he said kings when there was but one king, Pharazôn, who was not burned. Well, this is more of a colloquial term. The men of Westeros, the Dunedain, were also referred to as the kings of the sea in their time, and in the Third Age of Gondor it became the Sea Kings of old. Denethor II is not correct that no ship had come from the west. Many ships had come from Númenor, friendly ones and some not-so-friendly ones as well. Pharazôn himself had come in ships and grand armies and took Sauron back to Númenor, and even before this, colonizers from Númenor were taking over parts of Middle-earth, and some of them joined Sauron, the political splinter group known as the King's Party, later known as the Black Númenóreans, after Sauron taught them black magic. Pharazôn was not the first king to meddle with Middle-earth, and before the fall of the faithful, Númenor would come on friendlier terms. For example, the previous king, Tar Aldarion, was a great friend of Varangian Gil-galad and was so enamored by Middle-earth that the land of Middle-earth became sort of the other woman that ruined his marriage. But as I said, it is possible that in Denethor's state he forgot a bit of history, or more likely that he did know his history. He was said to be quite the scholar, but was being poetic, referring specifically to the ships that Elendil led the faithful to Middle-earth in. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, why did Sauron abandon his purpose in the Third Age to rule them all? He decided to destroy them all and become Morgoth 2.0. No. This is just demonstrably not true. Sauron never changed his goal. His goal was always to rule everybody through coercion and force. This means sometimes destroying, because there are people in the world that would rather be destroyed than ruled by one such as Sauron. The Third Age isn't even the first time that Sauron was destructive. The Second Age saw him systematically destroy Númenor. We talked about that just a little while ago, because he knew he'd never be able to control them. Of course, he took what Númenóreans he could under his wing, but he could not completely eradicate the faithful, so he goaded the unfaithful into attacking Valinor, which was the end of all of Númenor, except for the remnants that were already in Middle-earth or en route to Middle-earth. Elendil's realm and the elves represent two factions that he's never going to rule. He tried it with the Rings of Power, but the elves wouldn't use them once they sensed him. He discovered if he wanted full control over people using this method, they kind of had to already be evil. In the Third Age, he no longer has the One Ring, so he's going for a more old-fashioned approach, taking over the world through military might. He already rules most of it by the time the War of the Ring happens. The northwestern bit of Middle-earth that we see in the maps is only a small fraction of Middle-earth. He already has control over vast lands to the east and to the south. Some joined him willingly, some were slaves, some were conquered, some were mercenaries, but all that could not be conquered or coerced or enslaved or paid off would be destroyed, and that's always been his method. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Michael Seps, and I mentioned earlier that, I don't often get questions about Tolkien's translations, although we have one here. What's Middle-earth in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and why are the Lord of the Rings lands named like that? So I always imagine a big smile on Professor Tolkien's face when he translated that particular line as to contain the term Middle-earth, especially as he did the same in Beowulf. So let's examine the relevant portion of the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the original Middle English. So I'm going to put it on the screen here. And you might think, wow, I can't read that. That's not really English. It's Middle English, and I think that the problem that most people have with Middle English is that it looks very strange and they don't know how to pronounce the words. So I'm going to read this out loud to you, and I think you'll understand it a bit better. For uneath was the noise not a while ceased, and the first course in the court kindly served. There hails at the hall door an orly master, on the mould, on measure high. This may make it easier to understand hearing it like that, and it highlights how Middle English is not really that different from modern English, as you might think just glancing at it. It's all about, knowing how to pronounce the words. Now, one's mind may still boggle at words like uneath and orly. So uneath is an archaic adjective that means with great difficulty or hesitation. And orly is an adverb meaning full of awe, which we can interpret as both awful or awesome, depending on the mood that you're going for. You may also marvel at the word mold. This has a few meanings, the most common referring to a shaping mold, an item that you use. You pour materials into it to shape them into an object. It could also, though, mean earth, as in dirt, but with a reverential sort of tone, noting that this is the earth from which God formed man. This leads into the idea of a mold being a tool of creation, the mold of the earth, the dirt itself being a tool of creation. But the literal definition in the context of the poem is the land. Now let's look at Tolkien's translation of the passage. This is the way that he wrote it. For hardly had the music but a moment ended, and the first course in the court was customed to be served, when there passed through the portals a perilous horseman, the mightiest on Middle-earth in measure of height. So Tolkien is not transliterating the Middle English. He's translating it into a story that's written in his own style while remaining true to the original text. He interprets uneath as hardly, which itself has the root of with difficulty. You could see the word hard in there. But in the context, it's sort of saying it's right at this moment. It's, we had hardly finished and then this happened. It keeps the original linguistic roots of the word while also conveying the meaning with ease. Now, as for Ollie, he does not go with, more literal takes such as awesome or awful, but he chooses perilous. But of course, most curious is his choice to interpret the word mold as Middle-earth. Note that when he writes it, and if you have the book, and I have it here, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you may notice that Middle-earth is not capitalized, which he uses capital letters when he refers to Middle-earth as a location in Arda, which is the world of his mythology. But he's just referring to Middle-earth as, in place of a word that we can understand to mean the land. When you say the land, you wouldn't capitalize that unless you're maybe reading one of those dreadful Thomas Covenant novels. Before we get into why he made this choice, let's take a look at Beowulf. And now Beowulf is not written in Middle English. It was originally, written, it's a lot older. It was written in Old English or Anglo-Saxon. So I'm going to put some Old English here, a line from Beowulf on the screen. Now this is not easy to read for a lot of people at a glance, so let me pronounce it for you. So this is the way that you would say this sentence. Da ich wide gefragen wir gebannen, managere majo John this Midgard folksted fratwien. Well, now you see how it's pronounced there. So let's transliterate it. I'm going to take each word one by one and translate it into modern English. And then we get this. There is widely reported work ordered, many family beyond this world, meeting place adorned. Now we can start to see the meaning of the sentence, which Tolkien translated as such. Then have I heard that far and wide to many a kindred on this middle earth was that work proclaimed, the adorning of that dwelling of man. So Tolkien isn't merely just translating this sentence, but he's also adding a little bit. He's offering an explanation, and the key to understanding his only slightly cheeky choice to include the phrase Middle-earth in his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, as we can see a translation of Midgard as Middle-earth, and explaining that it's the dwelling of man. Midgard is derived from the Norse word Midgard, which basically means middle yard or middle enclosure. The middle in this is referring to being between heaven and the underworld. It's where men dwell. Tolkien uses it in his legendarium, most particularly The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, as a proper noun, hence the capital letters when he refers to that Middle-earth. But it is indeed the dwelling place of man in his books, because mortals must abide in Middle-earth, not the Undying Lands. The one time that it was experimented that men may dwell close to the Undying Lands was Numenor, which is Tolkien's sort of take on Atlantis, and, as we know, that ended in disaster. So, in the case of Beowulf, Tolkien was being pretty literal in his translation, but he was being fanciful in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, at least in terms of the phrase Middle-earth being there. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I think he just wanted to use the phrase because it appealed to him. The usual, if Middle English word for Middle-earth would have been Middle-earth, which is a derivation of Middengard, not mold. But Tolkien saw a golden opportunity, and he took it. Of course, this is fully his prerogative. The job of a translator is not to be literal. Otherwise, you get, the way that I transliterated it word by word, you could kind of get the meaning there, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The job of a translator is to not just to make it go into the target language, but to make it make sense in the target language and to the target demographic. So Tolkien was enamored by the idea of using the modern English Middle-earth to represent Midgard before he ever wrote stories of the land of Middle-earth. He came across a line in a poem called Christ A. the Advent Lyrics, which likely dates back to the early 9th century, and here I'm putting it on the screen. There it is, and that's in Old English. And once again, I'll pronounce it for you. Hail Eärendil, angel Björk's tust over Midgard, nonnen sended. Now this could be translated as such. Hail, that's a greeting. Eärendil is a name. Angel, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then we get to some of the weirder stuff. Björk's tust means brightest, and monum is basically man, but referring to the collective of man, mankind. So you would wind up with, greetings, Eärendil, brightest of the angels over Middle-earth sent to mankind. So Tolkien, he was reading and studying this poem, and it was just before World War I, and he became enamored of the name Eärendil, which he used in his earliest poems about his fantasy elves, eventually morphing into Eärendil, the father of Elrond. In 1917, as he convalesced in a military hospital recovering from trench fever, he wrote the first poetic version of Beren and Luthien, he started The Children of Húrin, and he wrote a primitive version of The Fall of Gondolin. He chose Middle-earth as the name of his mythological land, so when he later came to translate some of the stories that inspired him, Beowulf in particular was a large inspiration for the Children of Húrin and for The Hobbit, as well as the more comedic take that he had on it, which was Farmer Giles of Ham. He couldn't help himself but to use the term Middle-earth. I mean, can you really blame him? All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from, I hope I'm saying this right, Lana Pavlakovich, who asks, was an elm seen in the Shire in the first Lord of the Rings book an Entwife? Probably not. First, it should be mentioned that no elm tree was mentioned in Book 1, but rather Sam was talking about a tree man or a giant, stating that such creatures had been seen walking around near the Shire. Sam claims that his cousin Halfast saw one in the North Farthing, something that he did not state was an elm tree, but it was as big as an elm tree. Ted Sandyman, who rejected the idea, said that, well, it probably was an elm tree, which Sam retorts, well, it was walking, and describes the long strides that it took. If we believe Halfast, and therefore we believe Sam instead of Ted, we can assume that what was seen was either an ent or a huarn. The difference between them is that huarns are trees and ents are not trees. Huarns were described by Treebeard as trees that have grown entish and started walking around, and later we get a mess of them intervening at Helm's Deep. Ents are not trees, but they are the shepherds of the trees, and they sort of look vaguely tree-ish from a distance. I believe that what Halfast saw, though, was an ent, not a huarn. This is based on the description of the long strides that it takes while walking, which matches the way that ents walk, and the language used to describe them, tree man, rather than walking tree, and giant. The word ent literally means giant. And in the earliest drafts of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien had intended there to be two types of giants, the stone ents, or the giants of the mountains, and the tree ents, the giants of the wood. The stone ents had already featured in The Hobbit, but did not feature in The Lord of the Rings, and the idea of the tree ents went through a metamorphosis. They were originally sinister, and they were the minions of Saruman. Huarns came into the tale later because they were needed to show up at Helm's Deep, so I find it likely that with the evidence piling up, the word giant used as a descriptor there, the long strides matching the description of the way that ents walk later in the Two Towers, and the fact that Tolkien had not yet conceived Huarns when he wrote the passage, tells me that it was an ent. Of course, this is my opinion based on the text, and it was meant to be a mystery. Tolkien himself once even suggested that it may have been a troll of some sort. But was it an ent wife or an ent maiden? Now, I would state that this is possible, but very unlikely. Tolkien intended the disappearance of the ent wives and the ent maidens to be a mystery, that we would not know the truth. Now, when he was pressed to speak on their fate, the closest that we ever got to an answer was that he feared that they had all died. And like with the idea that Halfast had seen a troll, Tolkien shows that sometimes he speaks, as an authoritative expert on his work, but sometimes he's only offering a theory. His theory that it was a troll is fully credible, as ents had no idea exactly where the Entwives and the Entmaidens traveled after they were last seen. They disagreed on what direction they took, and the last area that they were seen in was raised by Sauron, an act that might have either killed them or reduced their population to a level that they would have been functionally extinct. Of course, there is room to interpret that the creature that Hal saw was indeed an Entwife, something that Treebeard would find hope in, as, after Merry and Pippin described the Old Forest to him, he states that sounds like an area that the Entwives would have liked, and he asked the hobbits to report back to him if they ever saw an Entwife in the area. Of course, the Old Forest is pretty far from the North Farthing. It's located at the edge of the East Farthing, but if we believe, and we may if we choose, that there are Entwives and Entmaidens in the Old Forest, then we can fully believe that they can take a nice stroll in the North Farthing. So I'm sorry that I can't give you a definitive answer, because it may have been an ent, or an Entwife, or an Entmaiden, or a Huorn, or even a troll, or Halfast was telling tall tales. Personally, I think he saw an ent. So there you go. All right, let's move on to the next question. So our next question came in anonymously. What was the original name of Mordor in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth? As far as we know, it never had any other name. Mordor is a Sindarin term for the land to the east of Gondor. It means black land. To the east of it is southern Rhûn, Rivanion is to the north, and to the southeast is Khand. The most notable feature of Mordor is the volcano Orodruin, which means Red Mountain, and it's also called Aemon Emarth, which means Mount Doom. Due to the volcano in the northeastern part of Mordor, those parts are somewhat a blighted land, most notably the plateau of Gorgoroth, which means the land of deadly fear. The very northeastern section is called Udun, which means hell. Due to the volcanic ash, it is a dark land, but also due to this, the southern parts of Mordor are quite fertile and green. Sauron did not take up residence in Mordor until the Second Age, and not much is known about it beforehand other than the Druidan who migrated from the Far East likely passed through it to get to the Southlands. However, in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, we learned that Orradre was created by Melkor, and due to this knowledge, it is very likely that he created Mordor itself, especially as it has this boxed-in geography of being surrounded by mountains on three sides, extremely similar to the geography of Hithlum. The mountains of Hithlum, where the configuration is a different angle and much larger, but it's almost exactly the same shape as Mordor, and we are explicitly told that Melkor created those mountains that make up Hithlum. So Melkor almost certainly created Mordor. Maybe it was the possible location that he would put a stronghold in. He didn't really get around to it. In the book Morgoth's Ring, it is said that while Melkor, or Morgoth, considered all of Middle-earth to be his domain, his ring that he poured his power into, his attention was temporarily focused on the northwest, that's Beleriand. Thus, if he had been successful in Beleriand, it seems likely that Mordor might have become, sort of an outer defense, sort of like a second Angband. So as for names, no other name but Mordor and the dwarf translation Nargun, which is mentioned in the book The Return of the Shadow, is ever recorded. It is possible that men or elves may have called it other things in the past, but Tolkien, in The Peoples of Middle-earth, states the following theory: maybe already an elvish name for that region because of the volcano Orradre and its eruptions, which were not made by Sauron, but were a relic of the devastating works of Melkor in the long First Age. So Tolkien states that perhaps the elves always called it Mordor, and thus I find it highly likely that Mordor was in fact the original name, unless Melkor himself might have had another name in his head, but he never said it out loud that we know of. All right, let's move on to the next question. Next, we have a movie question, and this one is anonymous. Who were the actresses considered for the role of Arwen in The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring? So the only actress that was considered for Arwen before Liv Tyler was cast was actually Uma Thurman. Personally, I don't see it. The possible casting of Uma Thurman may have only been because she was a big name, though she was not yet, Kill Bill levels of famous. She was known for films like Pulp Fiction and Gattaca, which were both good films. But then there was the more distasteful, Batman and Robin and The Avengers, which was the one that was based on the British spy show, not to be confused with the Marvel property. And then that was one of the worst films that I've ever seen. But I can hardly blame her for that. Interestingly enough, I once answered a question about why Liv Tyler got such high billing and prominence in marketing for The Lord of the Rings. And it was honestly because at that time she was one of the biggest names in the film, and she was sort of at the height of her career. That being said, Liv was a much closer fit for Arwen, so this all sort of worked out. So as for why Uma Thurman didn't play Arwen, it's a pretty boring answer. It's simple, it's boring. She became pregnant. I know. It's not exactly as interesting as to, like why Stuart Townsend got fired from playing Aragorn, which I covered in the previous video, but, reality isn't always that interesting. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Samantha Webster, who asks, did Gandalf take part in the War of Wrath in the First Age and the Battle of the Last Alliance in the Second Age? Probably not, and probably not. The being that we know as Gandalf or Mithrandir or any of the other myriad of names that he used or was given in Middle-earth is the incarnated form of the Ainus spirit Olorin, a being older than the universe itself, an angel, and one of the many beings who took part in its creation. They were the angels that sang the song of creation, and then this was made real by Iluvatar, that's God. We don't have an exact date for the arrival of Gandalf in Middle-earth, but this was one of the things that Tolkien changed his mind on. But the most accepted version has him arriving in Middle-earth as Gandalf in or around 1000 of the Third Age. That would put him too late to have taken part in the Last Alliance. Tolkien later revised the idea that the wizards arrived in 1000 of the Third Age, stating that some of them may have arrived in the Second Age. Though when he made this statement, it was in reference to the Blue Wizards, placing their arrival in the Second Age along with Glorfindel. Now, it's unknown if Tolkien intended to change the date of the arrival of Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast, and in fact, in some of his last writings, he said that Saruman came first, so then certainly Saruman would have had to have come in the Second Age. So we really don't know, because he was always changing his mind about this. But because he was always changing his mind, we're somewhat boxed into what is written in The Lord of the Rings that Gandalf arrived in the Third Age. Of course, he had been to Middle-earth in the past. In the deeps of time, he and 5 others, which were the same Ainu spirits who had become the later wizards, and Melian, and they came over and they shielded the newly awakened elves from the War of the Valar. We know that Melian stayed, at least until the fall of Doriath, but we're not told that the others stayed for any length of time, and they likely made the great journey along with the elves. Though it is not mentioned explicitly, it is believed that many Ainur took part in the War of Wrath. The host of the Valar was led by Ianwa, the chief of the Maiar. The Maiar are sort of the lesser angels. And though Tolkien was non-specific if any other Maiar took part in the war due to how destructive it is, it seems very likely. However, it seems unlikely that Olorin was in this war, due to the fact that at this point in the history he was known to be shy and not very warlike. It should be mentioned that out of the 5 wizards, only 2 of them were explicitly volunteers, Saruman and Moranitar. Romastana was taken to be a companion for Moranitar, and Radagast was sent to be a companion for Saruman, which was an idea that Saruman hated. But Gandalf was essentially drafted. He was known to travel. He had just gotten back from a journey within the Undying Lands when this all came up, but he balked at the idea of going to Middle-earth. His reasons being that he was fearful and weak. Manwë told him that these are the reasons that he needed to go, and let's be real, Manwë was right. Gandalf carried the whole team. An interesting note is that Sauron himself did not participate in the War of Wrath, and Gandalf was afraid of Sauron. I don't think he would have been so fearful of Sauron and feeling himself to be so weak compared to him if he had fought in a war against Morgoth, So there's that as well. All right, we have one more question, so let's get to it. Our final question is anonymous, and it is, did Sauron have the ability to create a sword as powerful as Anduril or Norsil? Yeah, absolutely. He could make swords better than that. But he just wasn't into making swords. It wasn't his thing. Sauron was one of the greatest at crafts that there ever was. Only the likes of Fëanor and Aula were likely to be greater than he was at crafting. He could make a sword much greater than Narsil, which was created by a dwarf named Telchar. However, you'll notice that you never really hear of Sauron making swords or using swords. You notice that there aren't a whole lot of evil swords in Tolkien's work. The closest thing being Anglachel, later reforged and renamed to Gurthang, which was forged out of meteoric iron by Eöl the Dark Elf, and it was said to be infused with his malice. However, even this sword, it wasn't like completely evil, it was just dark. It mourned the accidental slaying of Beleg Strongbow, and at one point Tolkien had the idea that Gurthang would be the sword that would put a permanent end to Melkor. Tolkien's villains don't use swords very much. The Nazgul, the Witch King at least, had a sword that, he lit on fire to try to intimidate Gandalf, which didn't work. But the evil foot soldiers, such as the orcs, they did carry them, usually scimitars. They're handy weapons in close range, but for important characters and important weapons, swords are usually favored by the heroes. Morgoth used a spear, and later a hammer, and Sauron, his weapon was his bare hands. So yes, Sauron could probably definitely make a sword even more magnificent and powerful than any sword that a dwarf could make, but sword making just wasn't his style. That's not what he was all about. So anyway, that's all the questions for this week. I look forward to answering more of your questions. And at this point in the video, I will ask that if you haven't subscribed, that you do. And let's be real, if you're at this point in the video and you haven't subscribed already, you're like, oh yes, I should, because you just watched like a whole hour of me talking about this stuff, including translating Old English and all this nonsense, you know. So definitely hit the subscribe button. And if you're saying to yourself, well, I'm already subscribed, check. Sometimes people get randomly unsubscribed. And I'm also going to ask, if you want to support the channel in a greater way, and you don't have to do this, but if you want to support me in a better way, consider membership. Membership is not very costly. It's like $5 a month, and you get to see all of the videos early, at least a week early, sometimes more than that. During live streams, you get some emotes that you can use, and you have a badge on your icon, both in live streams and when you leave comments. And actually, your comments get separated. I actually see them in a separate section, so they sort of get priority. I read those first because YouTube shows them to me, you know, above all the other questions. So, you know, like I said, consider membership. It's pretty grand and it helps me out. But of course, you know, just saying hi, leaving a comment, hitting the like button, and subscribing also helps me out a great deal. Now I'm going to head off of here, guys. I will see you guys next time.